Hi everyone, and welcome to a new video. It is CoCoVid! Woo! And I have a new pattern making video to share with you today. If you're new to my channel, my name is Laura Kane, and by day I am a professor of fashion design, and by night I am a cosplayer. I'm going to share with you methods on how to move darts around on a bodice, and then how to manipulate that pattern to do different yoke designs with added gathers. If you're new to my channel and you like what you see, please give that bell notification a hit. You can subscribe. If you have questions on any of the process for this, please go ahead and comment below. You can send me an email or a DM, and I'll do my best to respond to help you out with anything. Now, if you want to follow along with any of the exercises that I show you in this video, there's a few supplies that you're going to need. One is a bodice sloper pattern. You can use one with one dart, one with two darts. You could also do a full-size pattern, which is what I covered in my last video about sloper blocks. This one I made full-size because I am built asymmetrically, so this helps me fit better. If you want to practice these but not on a full-size pattern, there are half-scale patterns available out there. The principles to all of this apply exactly the same way. You are going to want some extra scrap paper. I like to use wrapping paper. I also have a giant roll of floor covering paper, which I picked up from Home Depot. It's got a little bit of hefty weight to it, and it holds a nice crease. You are going to want paper scissors and some Scotch tape. Now, flat pattern making is an art to itself, and there are many topics about how to manipulate patterns into all different kinds of shapes. You could spend hours and hours playing with patterns to get different garment results. You can also combine flat pattern making methods with draping, which is how I usually make garments. Everybody's gonna have a different experience and different preference for how they prefer to design. I'm gonna show you some very basic pattern making, so if this seems daunting to you, take it slow, try it on half scale if you have half scale pieces. This way you're not using tons of paper. This is one of those things that takes a lot of trial and error to really perfect and figure out, especially if you're building this for yourself, because standard patterns don't fit every body. So it helps if you take the time to get a base pattern that you know is going to fit you. You're going to have a much better time whenever you make alterations to this. You'll expect it to fit better if you start with a pattern that fits you really well. This is still not a foolproof method. I would always recommend making a mock-up of any new pattern that you do create so that you can perfect anything that might go wrong in the tracing or cutting process. There are a lot of resources out there for flat pattern making. I am using, for reference, the Pattern Making for Fashion Design. This is the 4th edition by Joseph-Armstrong. This is the textbook that I had when I was in school. There are newer editions than this, but a lot of the content is very similar. There are also other authors out there that make pattern making textbooks. I'll link a few of those down below, including Crawford, who I know does a lot more in plus sizes. Each pattern making textbook is slightly different, and you want to get an idea of what kind of visual style you might like, whether the text is easier for you to read than others. I'm just going off of this book because this is the one that I happen to own. We're going to start off the content of this video with first looking at basic dart manipulation, that is moving a dart around the outside area of your pattern. And then I'll show you how to take that dart, turn it into multiple darts, and how to then change the pattern into yoke style lines with added fullness in separate places. We'll also talk a little bit about how fabric is going to influence the final look of the garment, since one pattern can make up very differently in a thicker fabric versus a thinner fabric. So you want to have that in mind before you start making your pattern. So without further ado, let's get started. So first, let's talk about the basic bodice block. The basic bodice block is a starting point for basic fitting from the waist up. This has a high neckline, it has a single dart, could have a side dart here, depending on how you started it out. You can combine 2 darts into one or one into two, however you want to have it. It's got an armhole with a notch, and it goes out to the side seam. Now, mine has all of these markings on it for doing contouring, which is a more advanced technique, so you can kind of ignore the blue on here. But as long as you've got a bodice that's got a fitted dart on here, you should be good to start any of these alterations. So before we start actually cutting into our pattern or moving stuff around, we're going to talk a little bit about the principle of dart manipulation. So when you have a basic sloper block like this, this is the one that I drafted in my last video, so it accounts for my asymmetrical shoulders. The 2 darts that I have in here are right at the princess line, so these are waist darts. Now, I could take these darts and move them anywhere around the perimeter of my pattern and still get a consistent fit. Now, just to give you a visual aid before I go into actually showing you how to move everything about, here is a diagram from a pattern making textbook that I own by Joseph-Armstrong. This shows you kind of where you can put these various darts based on some specified places. So like center front neck here, a mid shoulder dart, a mid armhole dart, a straight dart, a French dart. But you could theoretically move this to any spot on this perimeter of your pattern. The principles to do it are exactly the same no matter where you put it. So with this, there are two different methods that you can use to actually move the darts around. The first one is the slash and spread method, which involves you actually cutting into your pattern, so you don't want to be using your original, so I've made myself a copy. Or the pivotal transfer technique. I personally prefer using slash and spread, but if you look at both of these, you get the same results, so it's really up to you which one you prefer. So for the slash and spread, you want to copy off your pattern, and then you're going to want to have some extra paper and some tape. All right, so we're going to start by first transferring this dart here over to the middle of the shoulder. So what you want to do is first measure your shoulder length. So mine is just about 5, so I'm going to make this at 2.5. Now you want your dart to be going to the apex of the bust, which for me was the top part of this dart. I made this specifically to go right to the end of my apex, so the fullest part of the body. And I'm going to draw a line connecting that midpoint of the shoulder to the apex. Okay, so now I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut from the midpoint of the shoulder right along this line through, but not to this point. I don't want to separate the two pieces out. So use some paper scissors. I have to find some. There we go. And you're going to cut through, but to, but not through. Okay, so now it rotates around this point. So now all we have to do is close up this dart leg. So we're going to push our pattern all the way to the end. My dart had a little bit of a contour in here, so I'm going to slightly overlap this. If you accidentally break it off like I did here, that's okay. Just make sure that you leave it nice and close. And then you can tape this back down. Now I have this giant open space. So I need to fill in this space with some extra paper. So you want to grab a piece of scrap. I'm going to grab scrap from my pile and tape it down. So before I can redraw in my dart, I want to get a nice angle here for the opening of the dart so that I'm not cutting it off too short. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this in as if I'm stitching the dart. So I'm going to go from center front to shoulder. See how I did that? So all my excess is over here. Now you can go in with your scissors and we're going to cut this straight across. Cut it along the neckline, along here. So what you want to end up with, and get rid of all this extra paper. You flip this over. You don't need as much extra back here. Just going to clean that up a little. All right, so then when you open up this dart, you're going to see this crazy shape. And that is so that when the dart is folded, it's not extending past your neckline. So on the back side, the dart excess actually goes all the way to the shoulder. Now, if you don't want to deal with all of that excess, you can do this so that it's not a full dart, but it's got seam allowances in here. and that's an easy fix to accommodate. So now we've got our dart opening. We do not want our dart going all the way to the bust point here, because that's how you end up with pointy boobs. So we're going to actually back up the tip about an inch. Now this might differ from person to person. You can go back an inch, half an inch. For larger busts, you want the dart to be a little bit further back. So for me, I'm going to bring this back about 1.25 inches, and I'm going to put it right in the middle of that space. Now I can redraw my dart legs from the end to this new point. Like so. Now, if you don't want to deal with all of that dart excess, you can add in 1/2 inch seam allowances by drawing 1/2 inch from the dart leg. Like so. So now you can cut out all of this excess. So then when you go to fold up this dart, these two edges go together, and there is your new dart. So we've moved that excess over to the shoulder, but it still is going to fit the same way that it did before. So now, as it stands, I have a dart at the waist on the left side, and a dart at the shoulder on the other side. Now, if I wanted to make this pattern symmetrical, I would repeat the process on the other side, pivoting the rest of this dart over here. So then I would have 2 shoulder darts that come right from the middle of the shoulder. So I'm going to go ahead and do that without instruction so that you can see this whole process a second time. All right, and now I have my finished bodice pattern with 2 shoulder darts instead of 2 waist darts. Okay, so I'm going to do a few different lines, and I'll show you how easy it is to quickly change up this pattern. So I'm going to put a line from the armhole notch to the bust apex. I'll do one to the midpoint of the neck, so about we'll say about 2 inches up from the neck. So we'll draw one from here to here. And then let's also do one from about 1 inch up from the side seam. And bring that to the bust point. The whole principle of this is that you are rotating this piece around the apex of the bust. So no matter where you put this line, as long as you're going toward the bust point, this is still going to fit. All right, so let's start with showing how this excess would be transferred to a side dart. So again, we're slashing to but not through. Do it on this side. Now, this whole process would be much faster if you did not have an asymmetrical body and you can work just on a half of a pattern, but I don't, so I got to do this for both. So now, to transfer this dart to the sides, we just close this part up. So now these can be overlapped just a smidge. Now I'm only bringing that bottom leg together and retaping it down. Now, if you wanted to, you could transfer only half of it to the side and have 4 darts. So if you brought those points down about 1 inch from the bust point and redrew the dart legs, you could easily have 4 darts instead of 2. And that makes it a little bit easier to control that fullness. Since this is a very big dart, I'm a busty girl, so the darts are big. But if I wanted to kind of balance it a little bit, I could put about half of that excess from the original dart into the side darts. But if you don't want that, you just close them up the rest of the way. So now let's go back to our original setting. Take these back down. Now let's do the neck darts. So now we're going to slash from those necklines down to the bust points. All right, so same principle. So now we're going to close up this dart and they're going to open up at the neckline. So you would have to stitch in those two darts before you get back to that original neckline shape. Again, you could also just take half of that fullness and have 4 darts. You could just do one on this side and one on that side. So however you want to arrange it, you can play with the design quite a bit. And then last but not least, we will do these side darts from the armhole. So I'm cutting from my notch. And then swing these open. So now our dart is at the side. Again, you could distribute this half and half, so you'd have a side dart at the armhole and a waist dart. If you wanted to, you could close this if you don't want waist darts at all, and then open up the line somewhere else. So now with this, you could have a side dart at the armhole and a dart at the neckline, and it would still fit. So as long as you're rotating around that point and you're putting that fullness somewhere, this is going to fit. You can't just eliminate out that shape. It has to go somewhere. So with dart manipulation, you're moving the dart around the fullest part of the bust somewhere. And that's if you want to have darts remaining. There are more advanced techniques by transferring this into fullness somewhere, and that is going to be our next step. All right, let's talk a little bit about math. So when you are adding fullness to something, you are presumably going to be either gathering or pleating that fullness into a smaller area. So what you want to have in mind is how much you need to add to that pattern to get the desired amount of fullness that you want. Now, with thinner fabrics can bunch up closer together. Things like tulle, organza, chiffons, lightweight batiste. These are very lightweight fabrics which can squash closer together, meaning you can fit more fabric in a smaller amount of space. A thicker fabric like denim, a heavy twill, a jacquard, a brocade, these are things that already are pretty densely woven, so when you go to gather them up, they don't squish down as much. So what you end up with is a very thick area of gathering, and you might not be able to fit that under your sewing machine. So depending on the final look that you want to have an idea of how your fabric behaves. Because if you make a pattern that is really big and you expect to gather that down into a small area and you picked a fabric that is not going to behave that way, you're going to end up having a bad time. So what I've done here is I've created a solid 6-inch piece. We're going to pretend that this is our main garment, and we are playing with 3 different gathering ratios. Now the ratio refers to how much larger that piece is that you are gathering up to fit the 6-inch piece. I've done 3 different gathering ratios here. I have a 9-inch piece, so that is 6 inches for the main one up to 9. So it is 1.5 times the original piece. So if you're looking at this, that's 6 inches there, plus another half, so 3 inches added onto it. So this would gather up to fit that piece. Now what I've done to give you an idea of what this looks like, here is 6 inches of muslin on top and a 9-inch piece of organza gathered to fit. So you'll see this bottom area, presumably the bottom end of your ruffle, kind of sits relatively straight. It doesn't have a lot of fullness to it. You can see where the gather lines are up here. You have some of that gathering happening, but it's not very thick. So in a lightweight fabric like this wants to just sort of lay out straight. This same exact pattern in a thicker fabric, this is the same size, but this is a heavier woven fabric. So you get some of that waviness on the bottom edge, and the fullness looks a little thicker. And that's because of the weight of the fabric. So these two were made with the same pattern pieces, but have a very different appearance. Now a 2-to-1 ratio would be twice the size of the original. So this is a 6-inch panel with a 12-inch one gathered up to fit. So it's twice that size. I personally like having at least twice the amount of fabric in there because I think it just makes a fuller looking ruffle. If I was just doing this for adding a little bit of gathers at a shoulder, I might not care that much about how big it is or how small it is. But for something like a ruffle, I like at least 2 times. So this is the 2-to-1 ratio in the organza, and you can see you're starting to see that nice wave at the bottom of that hem. And you can see where the fabric is starting to show some opaqueness where it's gathered up. And in the thicker fabrics, you have these nice rounded puffs, and the bottom hem is wiggly. So again, this is the 2-to-1 ratio, and you can see how this compares to the 1.5 to 1. And you can see how much fuller that looks. And that's just adding an extra 3 inches to the original pattern. So this was our 9-inch, 12-inch. And then finally, you could go to a 3-to-1 ratio, which in this case, I have an 18-inch strip of fabric gathered onto a 16-inch strip of fabric. Now, with this, the organza really looks nice in that larger gathering ratio because you have a lot more fabric in here, you have more areas of opaqueness, and you get that nice full end. Excuse the stains on this, I just used whatever scrap I had. It was an old curtain. So lighter weight fabrics like organzas and tulles and chiffons, you can go up to 5, 7, 8, 10, 15, 20 times the original size because they gather up really tight. If you're making a petticoat out of tulle, you might even be somewhere in the 20 to 30 to 1 range, depending on how thick you want that to be. Now in the woven fabric, this is getting a little crazy. This was a little bit more difficult to sew through. This is again 3-to-1 ratio. You do have a lot of fullness here, but in anything thicker than this, it would be really difficult to sew. This one works out okay because I pressed it nice and flat, but you could see how difficult it is to get all of that in one space. Like this is so bunched up. So you need to think about how much space you're allowing and in what kind of fabric you're using when you go to add fullness to your garment. Now it's very helpful before you start to have an idea of what kind of bodice shape you are going for. So I'm going to draw just a quick sketch of something that we can create. So let's do a rounded yoke right here, coming from the mid armhole. And let's add gathers along this top edge. Okay, so now we have a copy of our pattern. Now we're going to trace in where we want this yoke to be. So I'm going to trace it from about midway from the armhole And I'm just going to draw a curve. All right. Now we are going to connect the bust point, which is the end of my dart, to this line. So you'll need a ruler. And let's connect that line. So this is going to end up being one of our slash and spread points. But we don't want to just add fullness right in here because then it's going to look kind of silly with it only placed in one spot. So based on our sketch, we had gathers coming out in a couple of different spots along this area. So we're going to add 3 more straight lines. We're going to add one in between the line from our bust point and center front, another one about 1/3 of the way, and then another one about 1/3 of the way, and it's going to go towards the hem of this piece, or the waistline. These don't have to be measured out in any particular distance. You can just eyeball it. And we're going to put one here. All right. So now we're going to cut this pattern off right here. This is going to become our yoke piece. So you'll want to label this as your yoke. You could put a grain line on there. This is center front. If you wanted to have this button up the front, this is where at the point you would add a buttonhole extension to these pieces and cut that piece out. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these apart. All right, so my yoke piece is separate, so we can put that aside. We're going to just work on this one. Now what we're going to do is we're first going to deal with this dart. So we do not want to have a dart on the waistline of this piece. So we're going to transfer the dart excess to this part of the pattern. So what we're going to do is slash or cut up through this line, stopping just before the bust point. Doesn't matter which line you cut up because it's going to do the same thing. So you can do it from the right side or the left side. Now we're going to slash from this end towards the point, but stopping before we get to the point. So it's to, but not through this line. If you accidentally cut through it, that's okay. You can tape it back together. So now we have this little pivot area. So we're going to bring this dart, the first leg of this dart, and we're going to bring it over and close it up. Ha! I did not trace that correctly because they should line up at the bottom, but that is okay. I have a little bit of extra paper. I can redraw my line. And we're going to tape it together. Like so. Beautiful. All right, so for this next step, we're going to slash from the top end. Since this is the edge that we want to have gathers on it, we want to make it wider. So we're going to slash from here down to the waist, but not through the waist. So just like we did here to the bust point, but this time we're going to go all the way down to the waist. So for this line, same thing. For this line, same thing. So cutting to, but not through. So now you're going to need some scrap paper. All right, so I picked up some scrap paper. This is just the opposite side of the same paper, but I'm going to use the wrong side of the paper so you can see where I'm adding fullness. Now we are going to spread this pattern out. So we're going to split it open, trying to use as much of this paper as I can. Now this is where our gathering ratios come in because we want to have an idea of how much we want to add here. I mean, you can do as little as just, you know, 1/4 of an inch at each piece, or you can go crazy and like flip out this whole thing and connect a new line. So all of this area will have to be gathered up to fit the bottom seam of this yoke. So if you want to be really mathematical about it, we can measure this line and determine what our ratio is going to be. So if I'm going to do, let's measure this. I have a little measuring tape. Again, this is only half the pattern, so we're only doing from center front to side. This is roughly 8.5. So this is 8.5 inches from here to here. You can write it down. If we want to have a 2-to-1 gathering ratio, our final piece here has to measure twice the amount of that seam line. So we're going to make this 17 inches. 8.5 times 2, 17. So we're going to spread this out. We can kind of give a rough estimate. And we can check to see about how big this measures across. If you have pattern weights, you can use weights to hold this down in the meantime. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it a little bit. I got close. So roughly about here. So now we're going to tape this down. Now generally when you are spreading a pattern, you want to spread it relatively evenly between all the sections, unless you're looking to concentrate your gathers in one particular area. But since this is sort of an all-over gathered yoke, we're going to spread these relatively evenly. And you can go ahead and tape them down. And make sure you don't run out of tape. Okay, so this was our center front, so let's label it. Our grain line is parallel to center front, so you can add in your arrow. Now we have to draw in a new line that blends this whole section nice and smoothly. So you can use, I'm using my hip curve ruler. You can kind of eyeball this if you want. It's not too difficult to connect these together. And that is our new pattern piece. So now we can cut all of this off. This is my notch here. We can cut this pattern out, and that's going to be our new bodice front. All right, and there's our finished pattern. So this area, you will sew 2 lines of gathering stitches, pull it all in tight, and it'll fit this yoke. And what you'll end up with is this bodice here. So you can see I've sewn it up in some muslin, and you can see that the gathers are all going towards the waist and everything still fits nice and smooth. For this next design, let's do something a little bit more advanced. So with this one, we're going to do a seam line that runs from the mid-neck down through the princess seam, here and here. Our bust points are going to sit about here. And this middle panel is going to be gathered on both edges. Okay, so for this design, we're going to make a new copy of our bodice, and half the work is already done for us. So we want the gathering to come from where the princess line would normally be, which is where our dart sits when it's at the waistline. So we already have some of this pattern already split. So now we want to continue this line here up to our neck point. Now, I'm going to do this at a curve rather than keeping it a straight line so that I don't have a hard point. So I'm going to take my hip curve and I'm going to draw a curved line up to this point. And so this is a little bit more stylistic and gives us a little bit more of an advanced slash and spread. So let's draw this line up like this. So we want this area to be the gathered section and this area to not have any gathers on it. So now we're going to cut this piece apart. Before you cut it, I want you to add in a grain line to this middle piece. So now we're going to cut this piece apart. And there are our 2 pieces. So they would sew together like a princess seam and connect back together. Now, depending on how you're constructing this bodice, you may want to keep a copy of this middle panel because this can be a panel that you attach to underline the gathered section. So you could have a big giant section that's gathered up and anchored to a stable non-gathered piece. That's typically what's done in bridal wear and prom dresses. Like if you have a gathered middle panel of organza like on top of a woven ground, you'll want to make a copy of this piece. For the purposes of this lesson, I'm just going to cut up this original one because I'm honestly not going to be using this pattern to actually make anything. So I'm just going to show you how it looks in the end. Now we're going to determine where we want our gathers to go. Now in our illustration for this piece, our gathers were along this seam line right here, and they extend off to the other side. So this center front line is going to be cut on a fold, so we have to mark that. Now we have our piece. It has the fold line marked, so we're going to need some scrap paper, and we are going to draw slash lines through this pattern piece. We don't need a ton of them. I'm going to do about 5 or 6. They're going to go perpendicular to center front. So I'm going to draw a line here. Let's do another one here. And there. Okay. We also want to get an idea of how long this piece is because, again, we want to figure out what our ratio is going to be. So this piece is about 15 inches. So if we were going to do a 2-to-1 gathering ratio, we were going to have to spread this piece so that it's 30 inches long. For the purposes of this, let's do 1.5. So let's add another 7 inches or so to this panel. So our final piece will be about 7 inches longer. So what I like to do at this point is I will draw a line on my paper that I can use to help me spread this out nice and even. So we've got from the top end down, I'm going to mark 15. That's my original shape, so that's about yay long. So I'm measuring it up to this top here. Then I'm going to add another 7 inches to this piece, so to here. So the bottom of our piece now needs to meet down here. So we're going to extend this guy down here. So now we're going to cut this apart at all these different slash lines. All right, so I've gone in and taped down these pieces so that the top edge hits the top end of my line and the bottom edge hits the bottom edge of my line. So now I have to go in and draw a new line connecting these pieces. What you'll notice is that they're not even, so you have to blend a line. So you're gonna go in, kind of average out that shape. So you're not ending up with a jagged line right here. And now we can cut out this piece. So it cuts out all the way around here. This is our neckline. This is center front, which is going to be cut on a fold. And there's our pattern. So this meets up about here. So if you want to put a notch in so that you can match up where the middle of this piece is, that's going to be very helpful. So this is where my original bust point was. So when I'm sewing this, I can notch this end, and then I know to gather this end up to here and this end down to here. And I will show you what this looks like made up in muslin. Here I did not put a base layer on it, so if you wanted this to fit a little bit better and less poofy, you could pull this a little bit tighter across so that the gathers sit a little more straight. All right, with this one, let's do something a little funky. Let's do a middle inset panel that is diamond shaped. Well, it's not quite a diamond, but you get the idea. It's got an angle. And then we want to have gathers coming out from the top and from the side, like so. So we're going to have slash lines coming out to the armholes here and the shoulder, and slash lines coming out from the side. We're all going to do half this pattern, so we're going to draw a center front line in here, so you'll see where our kind of diamond shape's going to be. These corners are going to hit right at the bust points. Okay, so I've made a new copy of my pattern, and we're going to make our diamond shape in the middle band by connecting an angled line from bust point to somewhere along the center front. Let's do it here. So this middle piece right here, this is my middle center band. So let's label it. Draw cut on fold line. This area also has to be cut on a fold. This is the upper end of that bodice. And you can go in and add a grain line. And now we can remove this piece. So we don't need this one. So now we're going to draw in our slash lines. So the slash lines, we want the gathers coming from this lower end of the band, and we want them coming from this upper end of the diamond. From the band, we want the slash lines going towards the side seam. So let's draw a couple of lines. 1, 2, and 3. And then from the top end of the band, we'll do 1 toward the armhole, 1 toward the back half of the shoulder, and then 1 towards the front end of the shoulder. So those are our slash lines. So now you can cut this pattern out around the outer edges. All right, so now I have my piece cut out, and we're going to start slashing. So we're going to slash from that center, sorry, that, this is where our dart was. This is the top half of the diamond. We're going to go from the inside toward the outer edge of the pattern, but not through the lines, because we want to leave these lengths the same. So grab your scissors and start slashing. All right, so now we can start spreading these out. Now again, you could be mathematical about this. I'm going to kind of eyeball it a little bit. So I'm going to line up this middle part. This is what's on the fold, and I'm going to start spreading these out and taping them back down. All right, and now we're going to blend these lines. So this was our bust point, so make sure you know where that is, because that's going to be where your corner is going to be. And we're just going to go in and blend this. And now I can cut this piece out. All right, so when you cut this out, if you want this top end to be on a fold, it's a big piece, so make sure you have enough fabric to do that. You could also split this right up the middle. Let me get that nice and flat. You could also split this up the middle and have a seam if you want to be able to save some fabric, since this is a really wide piece. And that's going to be it for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. Please like and subscribe if you like what you see, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.